Property is Australia's biggest industry, representing more than 13% of GDP and employing 1.4 million Australians. Property and construction supply chains are very complex, reaching around Australia and across the world. This reach and impact puts us in a unique position to improve people's lives by addressing the social impacts of what we do, both here and overseas. Assessing and addressing modern slavery risks involves enabling staff and suppliers to speak up about human rights so property companies can make their activities more ethical and sustainable. That's what we're trying to do with this resource, show how organisations can listen and respond to modern slavery in property and construction.
Grievance mechanisms are those systems used to assess and investigate and respond to concerns around human rights and modern slavery. Systems not only for employees, but also for stakeholders and suppliers and workers throughout our supply chains. If we look at data from the supplier platform today, 69% of respondents say their organisation has a grievance mechanism or process in place to allow for the voice of the worker to be heard. That means, of course, that we need to work more closely, and that's the role of this guide, with the 31% that don't.
We also in the guide then set up answers to questions like, well, what do human rights grievance mechanisms actually look like? What kind of mechanisms are options for you? And how would you put them in place?
There is a perception that modern slavery is a phenomenon of developing countries. It's not here, it's not around us, it's somewhere else. My third point is that we should not consider that all the victims of modern slavery are the same. We have to understand the intersectionality. Women, migrant workers, children, those who speak a different language, though come from a different region and religion. And what is crucial for us is that they talk about that all businesses have an independent responsibility to respect all human rights. Can businesses and this industry put human rights on the top shelf? As important as making profit. And if they can put it on the top shelf, if the leadership is committed, then things will change.
Well, I think because the Property Initiative for Modern Slavery Working Group is such a diverse range of players, so there's some really large companies and then some smaller companies. So the purpose of the guide was to really build capacity and capability in our industry. So it gave us a best practice framework, but it also enabled us to say, oh, I'm doing that bit, but I didn't even know about that bit, or I can see that a group of that size could do it that way, but we might have to do it differently this way.
And the guide sets out sort of the main set of grievance mechanisms, which include things like they talk about company codes of conduct and access within that. I think they talk about whistleblower hotlines, worker voice platforms, a number of other third parties being involved, the involvement of unions. Generally, just one mechanism isn't going to be fit for purpose, because as Surya mentioned, that there's a wide variety of people who might want to access this and have very different needs. That if you have one of these mechanisms, or perhaps two, and you're not getting anything from them, it might be the mechanism's problem rather than the fact that there is nothing there to report.
CAF is a multi-stakeholder body, and a lot of the mechanisms that we employ, so we have a certification scheme for those that aren't aware of the work that we do, has been built by the industry and has had workers involved in the drafting of that certification scheme and the continuous refinement of that certification scheme. So they're involved in the development and running of that grievance mechanism. So we have one example of a building in Sydney where you had a cleaner that was being bullied by her supervisor. She wouldn't raise it because she was scared. It's a very well-founded fear. This does happen when cleaners speak up. Cleaners are vulnerable workers, so any vulnerable worker that speaks up is at risk of losing their job.
Not everybody who is experiencing contemporary forms of slavery knows that that's what's happening to them, and they're not necessarily always in these most extreme categories of vulnerability that we identify. And I think that this is something where grievance mechanisms are important for all of us as workers, white-collar workers as well, and that idea of making sure that workers' voices are heard is important for every single one of us in all of our organisations and in all of our roles as employees and employers.
So I think there's a real opportunity here for business to lead and be proactive in this area. It's always worse when you're reacting and you're fixing a problem. Things are always going to look worse for you.
One thing which I found quite useful and empowering for these workers is that if you bring them another person who has undergone that experience and able to overcome it by complaining, that is very empowering, because then they see a real case. So the peer learning is quite empowering in those particular situations, that this has actually happened, this was reported, and nothing worse happened to this worker. Rather, he or she is better off now.